Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the All in Crypto podcast. Today, I am delighted to be introducing my next guest. We have Mr. Troy McLachlan, who is the author of the Saturn Death Cult. Troy, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm well, and thank you so much for inviting me. This is probably one of the first interviews that I've been invited on that it works around the actual core subject of the world of finance and its effects on all of us. And I'm very excited to see where we go with this.
I share your excitement. One of the things that really stuck out to me about your work was how you relate it to central banking, the financial system. And you've also put forward the kind of idea that that's the kind of death elements of all of this in the form of bondage through these financial systems. And I haven't seen anybody yet really combine mythology, planetary astrology, and all of these things, finance under one roof and deliver it quite like you have. So I'm exceptionally excited. And with all my guests, I really like to start off with a bit about themselves. How did you start on this journey?
Well, many moons ago, I was at university and picked up a book in the library called Ages in Chaos. I was studying Egyptology at the time in Auckland, New Zealand. And the book was had the author's dedication, not a dedication, but a personal written note to my Egyptology professor. And it was simply a book that detailed an analysis of Egyptian history and a rearrangement of Egyptian history, largely to suit the biblical record. I thought this looked really, really interesting. I had a biblical background myself, so anything that looked at biblical issues and so on caught my interest. And I took that book to my professor and I said, I just wondered, and that's as far as I got. And he said, I don't do Velikovsky. And the aggression was palpable. And so the book was Ages in Chaos by Immanuel Velikovsky, the great heretic of the 1950s. And I just tried once more, and he bit my head off. I just don't, I don't do Velikovsky. And so probably because I was fresh out of my teens and so on like that, I still had that rebellious streak. I decided to do Velikovsky, and I proceeded to then go and devour everything, and found out that he was much more than just a person who was challenging the chronological establishment of history in terms of the Egyptology chronologies. But I found out that he had a cosmology that he had to put together in his famous book, Worlds in Collision, in order to support what he was saying happened in the historical record in both the Exodus account and the Egyptological records, the Egyptian records of what he claimed were at the time. A long story short of that, of course, is that Velikovsky, while very much, sort of superseded by other people in the realms of catastrophic investigation, natural catastrophic investigation. Velikovsky is the father of what a lot of people call the electric universe model of physics. And that basically posits that we don't exist in a gravity-only driven universe, but that the most powerful force in the universe is electricity, and that it's conducted through plasma, and plasma makes up that 95% of what the mainstream physicists refer to as dark energy and dark matter, and that this is the most powerful force governing the universe. And subsequent to that, of course, you learn of a subset of the electric universe, which is Saturn theory. And what I found once I got into Saturn theory, and we're talking over many years, reading different books, the greats like Cardona and Dave Talbot and Walt Thornhill, these kinds of guys, what I found was that there was a vast amount of alternative understanding in terms of the natural sciences as to the origins of the solar system, but that these had a huge, and I mean a huge effect on the human psyche in terms of how they how they manifest themselves within the living memory living corporate memory of the human species.
And would you say the way that they've manifested is through accounts such as the Abrahamic ones and the mythologies that we all sort of loosely learn about? Would you say that's how these events have kind of manifested through human consciousness?
Yeah, absolutely. What's called comparative mythology. All right, and you can dump the Bible and the Abrahamic religions. You can dump the Hindu texts and so on like that. You can certainly dump a lot of the Greek and Egyptian accounts, the Mesoamerican accounts. Certainly, the Chinese have a very long history in this, which is probably the area I'm least familiar with. But even down to the Pacific Islanders, where I grew up in New Zealand. You have accounts that all fit into this idea that whereas the um, mainstream thinking has always battled with how is it that you find the same kind of archetypes in mythology from such diverse groups around the world: South Americans, Polynesians, Africans, Chinese, European cultures, North American cultures, and there are only two. Solutions to this. One, the mainstream solution is that somehow a there's a diaspora of ideas starting from a central point that become diffused throughout the world, and that's why you've got the connection. The other one, which is where the electric universe comes into the calculations, is that every culture, every race, every creed, every clan, tribal group, every family group, at one point saw the same thing take place. And I mean, the key really to it is that what we're talking about uh, is looking at mythology not as made up psychodramas that are based on psychological issues within human psychology, but we're looking at mythology as actually recorded records of catastrophic events involving interplanetary bodies, and that all races, all creeds, all peoples saw this and wrote down their own version of it, but it's similar because they saw the same thing. They just have different words, different names, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, that that's basically where the mythological um, side comes in. It's the evidence, the written evidence left to future generations by the ancients as to what happened, that has been contrived by um, modern academia to not be a record of anything natural having happened, because it doesn't match what we see today. And today's modern mantra in academia, in the hard sciences and in the behavioral sciences, is really uh, the, the current world is the key to the past. What today is what is the key to what happened in the past, and nothing could be further from the truth as far as my own understanding and electric universe understanding is. It's analogous to they often will retro calculate back in time based on what they see today. It's just simply being cycled, the end result of cycle after cycle. As one person explained, if you send up a satellite into space, but you don't record the day or the place or the location where that rocket was blasted into space and loaded its satellite in, and you do a retro calculation on that satellite's current orbit, and it's been in orbit for 20 years, but you don't know when it happened, there's no way by retro calculating its orbit you will ever find out when it blasted off from the Earth's surface into the into orbit. And this is what we argue, that um, there's been a huge contrivance, particularly in the classical studies, and ancient studies by modern academics, to make mythology fit in such a way as it's compatible to what we see around us today. And so Saturn becomes simple sun worship, and because the sun has always been there, according to this modern way of thinking.
It's truly fascinating, and this is what there's a number of things that attracted me to your work. again, we're going to get onto how all of this is related to the financial system and systems more broadly, and we can talk about new golden ages that are in front of us and all of this stuff. But it's truly fascinating, and it always has been to me, that there is clearly a link between belief systems around the world. That there's a kind of thread that runs through them. Actually, probably more so than that, or interestingly, also, there's actual physical evidence of those beliefs through writing, of course, but actual structures. So, is it something that, and I imagine it would be that you've spent much time on thinking about how there are similar structures, perhaps of worship, we're not quite sure, around the world, in South America, in Egypt. You find people think pyramids are just an Egypt specific sort of find. That's not the case. In fact, that couldn't be further from the truth. Is that something you've thought about and have some thoughts on?
It's absolutely central to the cosmological argument that I make for connecting, what I call a worldwide occult cultural phenomenon. It's not a conspiracy. Conspiracy being something that requires too many gatekeepers to keep going and so on. The best way to manage any kind of way of thinking and groups of people who have ways of thinking is to basically influence the culture. And of course, as I alluded to before, if all cultures saw events that had deep psychological impacts on them that were passed down, and they all saw the same events, they'll all have a variation of that type of event. And one of the key aspects of that of the similarities in the comparative mythology is everything is oriented to the celestial north, where you see the North Star today. We've all seen those interesting star pictures where a camera is pointed to the North Star, and put on a time release setting, and you get that wheel that spins around the North Star because the Earth's rotation produces that result as you look up. And so the North Star is literally in axial alignment with the Earth, celestially speaking. But virtually every one of these temples, every one of these sacred places that you see in the world, particularly pre-Roman, no, including Rome, but pre-Christianity, you could say, has its orientation towards the north. The classic example. I read a book called The Atlantis Blueprint many years ago, and they had found out that they showed conclusively that virtually all the pyramid structures that you alluded to, whether in Mesoamerica, in Egypt, even the Chinese ones that they have, they're all oriented in terms of their functionality to the north, which makes no sense if everybody was worshipping a sun that was coming up, in the east and setting in the west. And even Stonehenge and its alignment with other henges shows a north oriented configuration, in terms of them. We can get into what Stonehenge represents, but for me, the classic example of that, well, the two, is the Parthenon in Rome, which is their thing to the gods. It was built, I think, in Hadrian's time, but it was, bafflingly oriented to the north, which meant that it didn't get the sunlight that supposedly everybody thought that the Romans worshipped Sol and the sun as we know it and so on like that. It just doesn't have that orientation. It's oriented to celestial north. And I've got to explain to people, celestial north is not geographic or magnetic north. It is it's the direction in which the Earth is moving along with the sun, in terms of towards that North Star sort of region. But the Great Pyramid of Giza is the single most how can I say this? It's the most accurately oriented building on Earth to celestial north. Now, given its antiquity, which can be debated by people, but let's just even take the mainstream idea of it being about 4,000 years old or so, maybe 3,500 years old. the fact is that even supposed continental drift has not shifted that alignment. It is still perfectly, and I mean perfectly, the building that next comes to being as closely aligned to north, celestial north, is the observatory at Greenwich, where we get Greenwich Mean Time. All right, which is a modern concept, and then that's number two, but number one is still the pyramid. There's thousands of years difference in that, proving that the pyramid has not shifted in all that time in terms of its orientation. But for a culture that is said to be oriented towards sun worship, that Osiris, that Ra, all of this is geared towards the sun that we see. Their most famous structure has no orientation whatsoever towards the east-west sort of concept. It is geared totally towards a perfect celestial north. Now, it's usually about this time that I will let people know that in terms of what this understanding of mythology is pointing to. I'll quote Eduardo Cardano, who I consider myself to be a student mostly of his work out of the Saturn theory type people. And basically, he says that the evidence of myth, which points to Saturn having once occupied a position above Earth's North Polar regions, is voluminous. There is not a race on Earth that has not preserved at least one account which states as much. According to this evidence, Saturn occupied a central position in that north celestial regions. It rotated, and it rotated widely, but other than that, it was immovable. And of course, this is probably the most difficult concept, for people to digest in what I'm positing here, and what even Saturn theory is positing. But this is the idea that world mythology tells us that the Earth was originally a satellite of a brown dwarf star, and that this brown dwarf star was catastrophically captured by the sun and eventually became the planet Saturn as we know it today. A little pinprick of light on the outer, skirts of the solar system. But before that, it had been a bright sunlight object at Earth's celestial north quite for some time before being dislodged again catastrophically to its current position. And it's bizarre that in mythology, wherever you see the association with the planet Saturn, which has many different names, Raven amongst the Mesoamericans, North American people, Kronos in the Greek, Yellow King in the Yellow Emperor in the Chinese, and so on. You get so many different variants of the name. Why is it that this little pinprick of light, as the solar system has been as it is, even though it was wandering around out there, why is it considered by the alchemical traditions and by mythology to have played such a massively central role in what took place in ancient times through what mythology then would demark as the ages of man? And the alchemical traditions refer to it as Earth's first sun and best sun, and so on. And it just made no sense to academia, and that's why they've contrived, wherever you see Saturn worship, they'll try and associate it with the sun that we have today. But it just doesn't fit in terms of the mythological record and what it's saying. And so mythology has been consigned to the realms of fairy tales. In other words, we argue mythology is a historical record. Modern thinking claims mythology is just another form of fairy tales.
And I happen to agree with your thinking on that. I always find us rather ignorant when we look back in history and think that they really didn't have a clue what they were on about. Perhaps we're the ones, if you listen to mainstream science, that don't have a clue what we're on about. Because you're absolutely correct in what we try and do is look around the world that we have today and make the past fit in with that. Whereas I think the opposite should be true. And if you want to understand the world that we live in, which is what me and you are going to explore, it's vital to understand how we got here and what the events were that led us here. That is of the utmost importance.
Yeah, that's history.
Absolutely. History. Let's get into, perhaps let's start with Saturn theory more broadly, a
Mhm.
overview. It's a big topic, but let's try and keep it as digestible as we possibly can for people that might have heard about this for the first time. And then we're going to
Mhm.
get into the Saturn Death Cult, and then we're going to explore more broadly all of the things that people should know about today, like what's going on with the financial system and so on. So
Mhm.
the Saturn theory, let's address that.
Okay, well, Saturn theory rests on two pillars. It rests on the mythological record that we've just been discussing, and it also rests on the electric universe physics model of the universe that we alluded to earlier when we were talking about Velikovsky and so on. But to put it in a nutshell, Saturn theory is the key element to the thinking that our solar system is not the result of the accretion disk model of which is which mainstream science posits that you get a disk of dust around a star that coagulates into various planetary bodies that ultimately become planets that orbit the star in the heliocentric model. And one of the key problems that many of the modern um, uh, mainstream, astrophysicists and so on, is that we've had an absolute deluge of data that's come in about exoplanets around other systems, and there is not one discovered exosolar system that even remotely looks like our own. Now, under the accretion disk idea, basically you have the terrestrial planets, rocky planets, the planets that inhabit the inner circles of orbit, and then you move out to gas giants that operate the mid areas, and then you move out to sort of ice gas giants that inhabit the outer realms. And of course, this is based on what we've been able to observe since the time of Galileo in terms of the heliocentric model of the solar system. We haven't found a single one of solar system, exosolar system, that even remotely looks like this. This is a big shock. It's not, but it's not the kind of thing that makes them wonder about their own models. They just go, "Oh, it was unexpected," and then carry on to interpreting based on the particular model of the accretion disk idea. What in the electric universe, and particularly in Saturn theory, is what we're positing is that the solar system is in fact an example of what's called a captured system. All right, meaning that you have a protostar that captures various bodies over time. It may have evolved with a protostar that had its own planet native to it, but in fact, some of these planets that we now see orbiting Earth were captured at a later date. The preposterous um, thing that we propose to most mainstream thinkers is that this happened during the memory of the human species. That we, as a species in ancient times, and I'm talking pretty relative, we're talking the last 40,000 years, witnessed a series of events that absolutely and utterly altered what the human species experienced on Earth. And that capture process, catastrophic in nature, is what is behind uh, the ancient concept of the ages of man, where you get this golden age, followed by a silver age, followed by a bronze and heroic age, into the current age that we are today, an iron age, kind of industrialized age that we have. But primarily, all mythology will allude to a time before a golden age as a kind of a void, a dusky dawn of time where there was no light. The Bible refers to that as the void
Yep.
created in a time. Popol Vuh will talk about the darkness that people existed in, living little better than animals and so on. This is again one of those consistent things that we have. Um, uh, when you look at the comparative mythologies, they all have this period of darkness that ends with this huge um, outpouring of light that kicks off a golden age ruled by the god Saturn, or whatever the name of whichever culture you're looking at, called Saturn, Quetzalcoatl, Kronos, these different names that you got, Ra, Osiris, and so on with the Egyptians, and so on. But that dark, dusky thing that Walt Thornhill dubbed the purple dawn of creation was a time where the color purple, the light, it wasn't complete blackness. There was a purplish duskiness, permanent duskiness, enveloped the earth, and that's what humans existed in for God knows how long. And that's what we claim was what life under a brown dwarf star would have been. The the thing that causes the light to flood onto the earth at the beginning of the golden age is the capture moment, or the first contact moment between that brown dwarf with its terrestrial planets, which we say included at the time Mars and Earth. It caused, according to electric universe principles, it caused that brown dwarf to have a nova-like short-circuiting event, which caused a massive outpouring of light never before seen on the Earth, hugely destructive, but completely and utterly life-changing for virtually every species on the planet, particularly for the human species, who suddenly now had the ability to calculate the passage of time. This is the key aspect of why Saturn becomes the god of time and becomes the god of the beginning of of uh, civilization, because there you have your first weight or measure, the calculation of time. And for those with an interest on a biblical point of view, that moment is encapsulated by the "Let there be light" moment of the Genesis account, where that happens. But Saturn becomes literally the god. I prefer him as like the god of the beginning of civilization. It's not farming and agriculture and so on. It's the ability to calculate time that kicks off the golden age, and every weight and measure comes out of that revelatory moment. It was a natural moment, but it was assumed in the minds of humans at the time it had a godlike origin to it, even if it had practical applications. It was seen as a gift, and this is why the original understanding of Saturn is of this, beneficial God, this beneficent God, that brought life, into onto the earth, and reestablished a world that, if you take the Genesis account, humans were then told to go out and measure, to go out and inhabit, and even procreate, because at that point in time they then had the ability to be able to, I don't know, it's very hard to explain how momentous this was, but you had the ability to say to somebody, "I will see you in the future at some location at a future date. Meet me there." And you
Yep.
could now do that. Prior to that, there was no chance. You would just, if you lost sight and sound contact um, with your um, with your immediate family members and so on, it was a 99% chance you were never going to see them again
Wow.
in the previous conditions. And so that's why
It,
Saturn is the beginning of civilization.
this is truly fascinating stuff, and I mean, I know through seeing Saturn pop up in history, and being able to, on the little work I've done on all this, be able to relate Saturn to various archetypes throughout history. I know that one of the
Mhm.
attributes is he's the god of time, or this sort of planet that rules over time, and there's a variety of other attributes there that we can kind of get into. So this golden
Yeah.
age, is this what you would have looked at as, perhaps to use a biblical reference, pre-flood? Is this the golden age that was spoken about? How does this fit into the kind of arc of history? This is the kind of
Mhm.
inception of a new dawn, if you will.
Yeah.
what are we sort of what are we talking here, and how does that get whacked out of line in regards to Saturn no longer sort of taking center stage in
Mhm.
today's world? I mean, that's quite a long
Yeah.
journey, but is there any kind of points we can plot in regards to that? Because that was a
Yeah.
golden age. Many cultures speak about a golden age that
Mhm.
a catastrophe followed.
Yeah.
Let's draw out of that.
Well, the to correlate chronologically biblical with other mythologies and so on, my take on that is we're not talking about the antediluvian. The antediluvian world of the Bible is actually the world after the end of the golden age that other mythologies talk about. So the golden age in biblical terms is the Edenic age, the Garden of Eden period. And the catastrophic failure of the golden age, which in biblical terms leads to the fall of mankind, or humankind as people like to see it, and it correlates with the destruction of the golden age, um, that led to a huge, massive catastrophic event that became what was called which modern psychologists refer to as the doomsday archetype. That underlying racial fear that the human species has of being wiped out by some event that is beyond our control, beyond anybody's control, no matter what it might be. This is because essentially you have the two most important archetypes that come out of mythology, whether you're talking about the biblical record, you're talking about the mythological records of other cultures and so on. You have the creator god archetype, sovereign creator of the physical universe as we know it, starting as a god who is beneficial, brings life into the world, um, creates a different world for human beings to inhabit and to actually take dominion of, and basically enjoy a fantastic period of time of development during that period. But according to most mythologies, it's not quite the same in the biblical side, although this does actually correspond to what's going on when we can talk about the appearance of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and what Christians refer to as the seduction of the serpent, seduction of Eve, and so on. But that is that things go bad with this creator God archetype. He becomes capricious, and so the same God that brings the concept of life, light, weights and measures, and with weights and measures comes justice. The idea that you can now interact with other people and have a basis, a standard, a set of standard weights and measures by which you can all trust and so on. This is all associated with the god Saturn before the end of the Golden Age, but the god Saturn becomes capricious, becomes ill, becomes violent, starts eating his own children, according to the mythologies. There is a massive rebellion against that creator god, and so on, and he is eventually overthrown from his perch, and the ensuing chaos is what becomes the doomsday archetype. It is so destructive, even in comparison to the destructive elements that launched the Golden Age. This one absolutely uh, terrifies the human species in such a way as it becomes ingrained in our psychic, our corporate psyche as a species. But worse than that is what emerges. It's not like you have a catastrophe and then you can rebuild back into a golden age, and there's the key: rebuilding back into a golden age. Right? What you're confronted with is the Silver Age, where the ancients talk about this being the time that the Earth, the seasons were introduced, and with the seasons comes an age where you don't have the plentiful year-round harvest that you can rely on to eat, to keep yourself fed. You have to start planning um, your um, your ability to survive winters as it becomes known, and it is it's the emergence of the uh, um, of the seasonal changes that result in people yearning to get back to what had been a golden age. And what I argue in the book is the emergence of the priesthoods who try to initially preserve what was great about the golden age, but at the same time, you start to get corruption because you have entered in the biblical account of the Silver Age is summed up in one word: by the sweat of your own brow will you make the earth yield its fruits. Before that, humans didn't have to do that, but now they have to work to get the fruits of the earth out into it. And so, therefore, they have to start organizing economies. And with economies, you've got to start organizing weights and measures. And with weights and measures governed by priesthoods, um, you run into the potential corruption that eventually happens, where those weights and measures become corrupted to the benefit of a few at the expense of the many. And this is where the book starts to begin to trace the origins of the modern central banking system.
Which is, I mean, we're a crypto channel and a finance channel more broadly. And one of the reasons that we got into this industry was due to understanding the kind of extractionary bondage style nature of the central banking systems. And then, you know, you go down a very kind of dark, deep rabbit hole on all of that, and you trace them throughout history, these systems that have been put in place to extract, often by, like you say, priesthoods and religious groups that have elements of what we're talking about through them, or it's directly correlated. So I really want to get onto all of that. What I want to do beforehand is explore. We've looked at the Saturn theory. Let's talk about the Saturn Death Cult, because this takes a turn in regards to understanding the lineage of things, but now actually attaching to it a cult, and more so than that, a death cult. Let's explain the Saturn Death Cult.
This is something that even since writing the book, I've come to develop my own ideas and understanding, because you're talking about things that get done down through history that are almost incomprehensible. The human sacrifice concepts that you find in ancient Carthage and down through the ages of the Bible, talks about this in terms of feeding children into the fire, this kind of thing. The absolute carnage that was taking place in the Americas, particularly in Mexico, under their particular priesthoods and so on, as recently as only 600 years ago,
Yep.
where you had mass slaughter and so on, but also this idea that that sacrifice somehow buys you influence with a capricious god. All right, and
That god being Saturn.
yes, or that archetype. All right,
Yep.
of power. And what I argue about is that with the end of the golden age, the golden age is often sort of seen as the paradise moment where fish are jumping into your frying pan, and the food is falling from the trees directly into your mouth. You don't have to worry about anything. It's a giant holiday with nothing to worry about. But I argue that the golden age is called as such because people relied on weights and measures to be justly administered. Everybody was aware if there was a dispute, there was a way to um, arbitrate the dispute based on knowledge of weights and measures that were governing how humans interact with each other. This is the key. The whole thing about weights and measures is it allows you to interact with people you've never met before, all right, using weights and measures that both parties trust. Okay, if they get into dispute, the weights and measures are the means by which that dispute is arbitrated. It becomes the benchmark for it. So there are plenty of different weights and measures that come out of the calculation of time, length, weight itself, all this. But this is the key to understanding where we're going ultimately with what the Saturn Death Cult is and why it has this obsession with death. The key weight measure at play here is a thing called money. And most people, they think of money as a means of exchange. That's a currency. Money is money is the means by which you value work done. It's the thing that measures work that has been done. So if I put in a lot of work to make a mud pie, and you put in a lot of work to make a loaf of bread, all right, we've both put in the same amount of work, but somebody's going to give you money for the loaf of bread instead of my mud pie, if you accept, their money. And so therefore, the money that buys your loaf is a measure of the work you've done to be able to to make that loaf. And so price becomes the increments of that measure in terms of how you adjust that. And of course, control over how you calculate that measure, how you do those increments and so on, becomes key to controlling economies and such down through the ages. Now, one of the problems with what's been happening down through the ages is that after the Doomsday event that had such a huge effect on people, there was this common desire to get back to that wonderful age that the Golden Age spoke of. And it was quickly realized by certain people that I'm not really happy having to, produce sweat on my brow to make the earth yield its fruits. What if I can get everybody else to do it? It's as simple as that. It is just quite simply, how can I manipulate other people to do this? Well, there's one way. You can threaten to punch them in the head, to kill them, to do all these sorts of things. But that tends to, after, once they get up to about 4 or 5 guys, they'll kind of figure out, no, we can take this guy or something. So you have to come up with different mechanisms by which to get other people to labor on your behalf to give you a golden age. All right, that that was enjoyed by people during the so-called Golden Age time. And yes, people throughout history, elites have enjoyed extremely lives that could only be called paradise compared to most of the people around them. And I'm sure we'll get into why this happens, the mechanism, how it works. But to answer the question as to why there is a death cult around this, what it's about, it has to go back also to the Golden Age idea that humans were immortal. You got it with Adam; he was immortal in the Bible during the time of Eden. You have all these different sort of concepts of immortality, and so death is brought into the world by the fall of the Golden Age. Remember, we talked about it being correlated with the fall of man in the Bible. That's 2 reference points, mythologically speaking, you can look at. And so when you're talking about the death cult, while you are talking about death cult, they're obsessed with their own death, but what they are obsessed with most is in cheating death. And the way to cheat death is to somehow get into the good books of the capricious God who originally destroyed the Golden Age through capricious nature. This is why Saturn is symbolized not only as the god of time, but he ultimately gets the symbol of the scythe. First, it's kind of the harvest that comes out, whatever, but then he starts harvesting humans, killing them. And this is the two-sided nature of the Saturn god. And so what you get during what I call the priestly age or the silver age, immediately after the catastrophic time periods, you get a different type of thinking. You get a thinking that says, let's get back to just weights and measures and let God judge us. Let the creator God archetype judge us on how we live according to good weights and measures. And then you get the other sort of thinking, hang on, he's going to kill everybody anyway. At some point, he's going to get out of bed the wrong way and he's going to do this. It's going to do this, whatever their visualization is of this creator God archetype. We need ways for it to look away from us when he goes on the next killing spree. And so we need to influence that God in ways that will make it possible for us, if possible, for him to overlook us. And I've often used the analogy, it's like being in a gang with a particularly unpredictable gang boss, violent gang boss. When he walks into the room, all right, no one's sure who he's going to turn his violence on. And so everybody starts to position themselves in such a way as to become a favorite of that gang boss. will extrapolate that kind of thinking to the idea that a capricious God may one day return and absolutely wipe out the human species again. But if in some way I can influence that God to look on me as a kindred spirit, as one of his children. And there's an interesting word, all right? A child of that God, a child of Saturn, a child of God, per se. Then I may have a chance of not only surviving but becoming the inheritor of the authority of that God. In the meantime, I'm going to work towards that in the world that we live in while we wait for another doomsday. And this is why when you get the Silver Age period of priests, which is roughly 4000 BC up to about 1000 BC, and so on, before you enter into the heroic age, or the Greeks and so on like that, this is why you get this idea of watching the heavens. Why the mystery schools, the astrological mystery schools, become so incredibly important, because for that period of time the planets are still going crazy. They're still erratic and haven't settled into their new orbit. And watching the planets gives you an idea of when the next pass by might wipe out a kingdom, might wipe out the whole human species, and so on. And this becomes absolutely paramount during those years amongst these priesthoods, and why they build their temples and so on, and develop their religions and so on. But the sacrificial element, all right, is what is at the base of ensuring that you have some sort of favor bestowed on you by a future rampaging God on the return, if it should ever happen. And this is, to actually jump, like I think I've done this in an interview before, but to jump ahead of that, you get that symmetrical idea then that a golden age, great, we want that. It gets destroyed by a doomsday. We don't want that, but to get back to another golden age, we probably need another doomsday.
Yep.
To get through, to get back to a golden age, and this is where you get the symmetrical concept. I forget what they call it in the Bible. Even literature of the ancient times is dominated by this the symmetry of ideas, of prophecies, things like that. And so, you have this idea of golden age, doomsday event, silver age, bronze age, iron age, doomsday event, golden age, and you're back into your golden age and the repetition.
I
As you
think it was
see it.
Daniel, right? Was it Daniel that had the dream? Is there something relatable here in regards to the ages that he saw with the statue? There was various going down to the feet of the statue,
Yeah.
which was the
Mhm.
iron kind of age. I mean, there's got to be a
Yeah.
crossover there? And I think
Oh, most
one thing,
definitely.
absolutely, I think one thing I want to touch on as well is this idea that people would do something so horrific to gain favor with a god, in this
Mhm.
case Saturn, or however they view Saturn, isn't an
Yeah.
alien one. This has been done throughout history on a mass scale in abominable manners. I mean, this is history. With like even the mainstream science would, or mainstream historians would agree with the use of these kind of methods to gain favor with, whether it was for a good harvest, whether it was for, but we're talking about it in the sense of gaining favor with Saturn, or whatever abbreviation of that they have, to essentially see favor in the next life and look to bring this golden age upon us. Let's talk about, because I think this golden age that we're moving towards is really interesting. We'll talk about the technological aspect of that all and how they're going to use technology to perhaps enable it. But let's talk about methods of control. So are we talking about a group of people here who are in the know, that ultimately understand the things that we're talking about today, want to bring about this age? How are they looking to do that, and what methods are they using, and how is that relatable to money, which you perfectly explained is really more than physical or anything. It's a belief, it's an ideology, it's a method to weigh things that's been controlled, and it fits into this whole narrative of things. Let's talk historically about these people going from post golden age to kind of where we are today, and how the monetary system plays into all that.
Okay, so as we were talking about, a death cult, and so a death cult can, in its fundamental way, it can talk about, if I can sacrifice other people, I may gain favor for whatever reasons are given to me by an acolyte class of, occult thinkers or whatever along those lines. But essentially, what there's almost a paradox here. What they're trying to do is cheat death. They're looking for immortality. And as alluded to before, since the time of the cataclysm, we've lived in a world of scarcity. And if you are going to if you're going to evade death and find immortality, control of resources is one of the key aspects of being able to do this. So the original in the mystery schools of the ancient time, the alchemists were your first sort of technological attempt at trying to find immortality, the Philosopher's Stone, the Fountain of Youth, all of these things that come through that you get. And you see, even in the biblical account, you see Adam going from immortal to somebody who can live 1,000 years, 940 years to be exact, to the human life being brought down to only 120 years by the time of Moses in terms of human lifespans. And it's the ability to cheat that drives a lot of people. Now, I'll go into a little bit of biblical related stuff because it does actually affect where we'll go with money in terms of the kind of people that control our financial systems as it is today. But the key to understanding what is happening in the world of people who understand that this idea of mythology having some kind of, you could say, supernatural effect on history down through the ages and taking part of that. If you go to Genesis 3:22, which is an interesting number, 322, when it comes to the study of secret societies and so on. Genesis 3:22 talks about the shock after the event where the characters Adam and Eve partake of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and their access to the tree of life will make them gods like us. All right, so there's this idea that immortality is equated to godlike existence, and that is an admission in terms of that particular mythology that you can find correlated in other mythologies, that human beings can become immortal, not necessarily because of it being bestowed by a creator God, but on their own steam, by their own power, by their own abilities. And so this is, this comes back, this is a theme throughout much of the esoteric world and in terms of biblical stuff, that they go hunting for the means by which we as humans can attain godlike status without having to do what we're told by a supreme creator God and such. But we can, in the process, mollify that God by doing things that influence that God in such a way as whatever justice that God is going to visit upon us is going to be somehow different for one group of people, a minority, compared to everybody else. And this is the two-tiered system that we all know exists in the world. And we think it's pretty bad today, but it's been like this since the time of Babylon, where there is a different system of justice for some people compared to others. Whereas the original, I hesitate to say it, but the original Egyptian concept, who were resurrectionists and not reincarnationists, they looked to a system where one was judged according to your life, the life that you had pursued, and judged according to these weights and measures, these laws as such. So therefore, the supreme creator God is a lawgiver, and law is what judges you, not the mood of the God that gave you the laws. Whereas the Saturn Death Cult concept is quite simply, I don't want to die, but I don't want to have to live according to the laws and premises of the Creator God and its beneficent side of things, because that means I don't get to exploit people, I don't get to enslave people, I don't get to try to monopolize stuff for my own benefit, because there are laws against that. So we're going to create a culture that quite literally cheats death and supersedes the creator God, in the sense that we will, in the modern sense, the alchemists have been trying this for centuries, but in the modern sense, we'll find the technological means to elevate ourselves up to immortal beings. And this is why the transhumanist element, this is why probably the most important movie, in my opinion, ever made was Kubrick's 2001 Odyssey, because it's basically an initiation into the concept of the next evolutionary step that these people see, which is the star child who is literally become immortal through technological means.
We're going so deep on it, and this is really where we relate things to where, or what we do in regards to finance. Some of the means in which they're used, or one big one, is of course the financial system. How do you exploit labor? How do you exploit people? Well, certainly if you look at today's world, the problems that people have are often financially related, and they have entirely given us a sensory overload in regards to the monetary system that we have and its power and its status. And I just wonder how we got there. So we're talking about people exploiting people. We're talking about this kind of concepts of why these people do what they do, the beliefs behind it. Let's talk about the apparatus. Let's start to get into the financial system, and with that, and how they've used that. We can give a historical context we've spoken about a little bit, but more broadly, central banking and why it's an issue. Then we can get into the golden age and technology and how they're doing this. And I love the segue there into transhumanism. I think this agenda is being pushed largely for the exact reason that you mentioned, so that it can become kind of acceptable, and they're doing it in a kind of heartstringy way, if you will. You know, they're trying to get people to feel very sorry for um, what's going on, and accept it via that. You know, so let's maybe tackle the financial aspect to all of this, because it is truly fascinating, and it very much explains the world that we live in.
Well, it's the it's quite simply the greatest con job that has ever been perpetrated down through human history. There's a reason why all the major Abrahamic religions and virtually all the major world religions have a prohibition against a thing called usury, which modern religionist people will try to say, that just means excessive interest. No, usury means any increase on money. And as we discussed earlier, what is money? Money, people confuse it with currency, all right? But money is the bedrock of a system that measures the value of the work, the productivity that you engage in, and so on. So, it's the old story. We take a risk when we go to try and produce something, in that people will want to buy it. All right. But what is it that we're going to take in payment if they want to buy it? If we're lucky enough to come up with a product that other people want to get from us and are willing to pay for it, what are we going to take in payment? And that's what we call money. And money, has existed in various forms: fiat, gold-backed, all these sorts of things. But it is essentially a measure. So if you are somebody who wants to control the resources, now when I say wants to control the resources, not necessarily talking about ownership of the land that the resources are mined out of, because that's another debate, theological debate, that's come down through the pre-stage and so on. Effectively, the world and all that's in it belongs to the creator God archetype. All right, it it how do you monopolize, or how do you get to control the labor that's used to extract those resources to produce a lifestyle that is comfortable? All right. How do you do that? How do you get people to work for you in such a way that you don't have to work? You don't have to be part of the mining gang going down. You don't have to work in the fields. You don't have to be out in the boat getting the fish in and so on like that. Okay. This is the key understanding as to how this con job works, in terms of how this has been an absolute curse on humanity down through the ages. And it is not money, or the love of money is the root of all evil, according to a biblical New Testament phrase and so on. Timothy, yes, that's right. But money is not evil. It's the love of it. What produces the love of money? the love of money is this desire to be able to take other people's productivity, which is basically called theft if you haven't earned it yourself, and such, right? Haven't earned the means by which you pay for it and so on. So how do you go about ensuring that people will succumb to a system that, on its face, is so blindingly obvious a scam, but you've got to somehow get this to happen if you're going to get that kind of control over the world's resources through other people's productivity. And that is when you distort the measure that we call money with something called interest. All right, it's as old. It, 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 it's as old as Babylon itself, and probably even older than that in some respects. Now, the way to do that, first of all, the whole in its very basic form, interest is this: I lend you $10, and there are only $10 in the world that exist. You can't make an 11th dollar. You're not allowed to make that $11. And at the end of the year, I want you to give me $11 back. I've just asked you to do the impossible. But if you can't give me that $11th back that you can never ever get, that you can never ever produce, guess what? I get to take all your stuff. That's how the original concept of interest banking worked, where a currency or money is introduced as a debt on the people who will use that money but has to pay it back at interest. So the key to this, all right, is that there are two main features to the scam. One, have a monopoly on the issuance of a form of currency that is only recognized as legal tender in whatever realm or state you're in which the monopoly operates. And two, that you can organize and financially facilitate with that monopoly the imprisonment, destruction, and killing of any people operating a competitive currency money system. Okay, so where evil comes into the picture is when that monopoly uh, is issued as a currency combined with debt or with interest, as part of the way it's issued into that community. But those are the key features. You have to have that monopoly, and you have to back it up with force to the point of killing people. And then you have to issue that currency as a debt on the people who are forced to take it in order to engage in economic activity. Now, that's the basic scam, and nobody would fall for it if it was left that simple. Because all they do is they roll over the debt, which leads to a thing called national debt. And this has happened time and time and time again. They just keep building it up, and it seems great at the beginning. It facilitates a lot of economic activity. Somebody always loses at the end of the year or at the end of the financial year, whatever it is. But that's maybe one person out of a million to start off with. And then it grows. And this is a system that even these people who have operated it down through the years, down through the centuries and millennia, they know it lasts usually about 70 years, at maximum 120 years, before it actually implodes on its own weight. And we can get into why the ancients had a thing called jubilee and debt release and so on in ancient times that sort of really worked very well. But it's that monopoly, to issue money as a debt and to back it up with force against people who would want to break away from that, that you end up finding is the absolute hallmarks of ultimate evil in terms of what I call the Saturn Death Cult culture that we have in the world. They always gravitate towards a banking system, as a form of control. In the ancient times, priests were charged with keeping the weights and measures honest, and warriors with their code would back it up. We now live in a world where merchants define the market, merchants define our weights and measures, and soldiers are in the pay of the merchants to do what they're told, to go out and kill people who would challenge that.
Couldn't be more evident in regards to today's world. I mean, the reason that I got into the cryptocurrency space was through understanding Bitcoin and what it was trying to do. It was initially sold to us as something that was going to challenge the central banking system. And that was unbelievably appealing to me. Now, that whole narrative, I believe, was hijacked. Bitcoin is not a practical currency and was probably never destined to be one. And perhaps more so was an introduction into a more controllable, more pure fiat. Um, we're now talking about evolving money so that it's backed by money comes into creation through debt. You know, there's two parts to it, like you outline, and this is evident throughout history. But we're now talking about kind of democratizing that to more of a degree when everybody can now get access to this currency that is directly backed by debt, not by being held by a central bank, but them. So we're extending this. This is the really interesting thing with everything that we're talking about is you can see the escalation of it and the clear evidence that most people in the crypto space are now aware of, but people more broadly are financially educating themselves of control through money manipulation. And this has been evident throughout history. Before we dive into sort of different aspects of this, you mentioned this stuff sort of lasts for 70, perhaps 120 years. Are there any other accounts that you can look at historically? The Romans, I know we spoke about a little bit off camera, that you can see the parallels with in regards to today's system, and we can maybe bring in jubilees and things like this. Has this stuff happened before historically? Because I believe it has. I'm sure you do as well, but perhaps on a more global scale today. And that's the scary nature of it.
Yeah, multiple times, and there is a roughly a 400-year turning that takes place when you look at the overall cycles. We're right in the middle of one of those 400-year turnings. In other words, we're coming into a turning that the last turning you can relate back to the French Revolution, the establishment of the Bank of England, and so on. As forces for what we've been under. But yeah, every 70 to within those 400-year cycles, you get what you would call controllable crashes, where I argue that this form of central banking that we now have today has been refined, down through the millennia, where it started in the temples with what you would call a temple tax, where fractional reserve lending was then operated against whatever they had in terms of silver or gold or whatever it is, even clay tablets if they were doing fiat currency, in order to inflate the system, which would then crash. You, as a Christian, will be aware of the story of Joseph, who was given a vision about a coming famine. And he basically looked at 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, and he used the 7 years of plenty to inure Egypt against the famine. But what a lot of people overlook is they should think of the famine, maybe the Nile dried up for a while or something like that. The Bible's very specific. It says the money failed, all right, and that was the beginning of the famine. That's what a lot of people overlook. And that's one of your first indications of where the finances and so on, systems that they had back then, that money itself was also failing periodically. And so any debt-based system will ultimately implode, because it's a pyramid, Ponzi type system, where you've got to keep issuing debt on debt on debt in order to keep the thing functioning. And as that happens, less and less people benefit over time, and then you get that mass disparity of wealth at the end of it. Biblically speaking, the Tower of Babel story, Babel as some people might want to call it, is your first financial crash. Everybody thinks that is a story about a real estate project, a kind of naive attempt to reach heaven by building a structure that elevated you into the sky, and that God changed all the languages and so on. There's a part in my book where I go into detail in my own sort of interpretation, retranslation of the Babel myth, to show that in fact what was happening there was your first instance of what I would call a non-biblical financial system that was based on debt, that would become the basis of the system that would power Babylon into its zenith under Nebuchadnezzar, and that is, well, Babel is actually the origins of of Babylon. I mean, the word Babel means confusion, or Babylon means confusion, as such. And there is a correlation between the Tower of Babel incident and what you find happening on the plains of Dura with the establishment of the gold statue in the book of Daniel, where we read about people having to bow down to it. That should always be interpreted as the establishment of the first gold standard of financial working. The biblical standard has always been based on a silver standard, based on correlated with how much an acre of land can produce in terms of barley. In other words, it's linked to the productivity of an agrarian nation. What the Babylonians did was that they created a system where all you had to have was gold. They mined it out, and then they issued against that gold backing, and everybody had to partake in that. And of course, this is, for the Christians out there who might find this interesting, some people, I know this is probably a little bit too biblical, but that statue and its measurements comes out to the number 666. It was 666 cubits in terms of its size. It's the same number that you use for the beast later on. Everybody has to bow down to and take its mark, its bounty, and so on like that you get in the book of Revelation. And to me, that is pointing to a financial system that is in opposition to the creator God of the Bible, the archetypal creator God of the Bible, where gold is the means by which that financial system is backed, but ultimately corrupted when you get into a thing called fractional reserve. So the fall of Babylon, the fall of Babel, was your first sort of mythological account of one of these disasters, and then you get a series of them. Earlier to that, the money failed in Egypt, according to the Bible, and you can find other examples of money failing in the ancient world. The next really big one that we can put definite documented evidence to is the financial crisis in Rome in 33 AD, which correlates to the time that Jesus Christ was crucified according to biblical texts. But without bringing Jesus Christ into that and so on, that was a result of the temple tax and what was happening in Jerusalem with the temple tax. It was bleeding Rome of its silver because the temple was issuing receipts, fractional reserve lending, against the silver that was coming in as a temple tax. And those receipts were then used to buy goods coming in from the east that were then sold to the Romans, luxury goods for silver, which was then deposited in the bank, and the cycle begins again with more fractional reserve lending and so on. And it took the Romans right the way up to 70 AD to figure out really what was going on. That's why they destroyed and burned that temple down, and why they tore every brick. They were looking for all the silver they thought was stored in there, all the gold that was stored in there. But that was a huge, massive crisis. That was literally only it was only solved because Tiberius Caesar, the richest man on earth at the time, actually gave his entire wealth so that Rome could pay its debts off to the banks. It's my belief this is one of the reasons Tiberius Caesar is actually denigrated as one of the most decadent, awful individuals to have ever ruled Rome. He got offside with the banking people. Well, after that, we find that as a result of what happened in Jerusalem and Rome's retribution, the financial system moves to Rome and then up to Venice. We have the next huge, big, massive problem. Well, we have a collapse of the Roman Empire in the 300s, late 300s, the 4th century AD, and that's what facilitated the move of the people practicing this particular banking system that has its roots in Babylon, setting themselves up in the swamp of Venice, the original swamp, as people like to call Washington and so on like that today, but also ends up being what you would call the Florentine Venetian banking system. And that comes to a catastrophic end in the 1340s or the early 1300s when the King of England defaulted on his um, on his debt, and that triggers a financial crisis, which then triggers a famine, which triggers a health crisis, which results in the Black Death being able to spread incredibly easily throughout the world, and you get the Black Death. Probably the closest thing I think to a doomsday event the human species has ever suffered. Um, well, particularly in Europe, but as far as China, I don't know what happened in Africa, but as far as China, this is what happened, and then from there you end up with the French Revolution and the advent of central banking as we know it as a solution to the problems, the financial problems that were coming about as a result of bubbles, as a result of the corruption and the priesthoods and I'm talking about the Catholic priesthoods and the royalty who were under them and so on. And that fourth turning results in in what we see as the British Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the United States as an entity in world history. Possibly the greatest example of growth in human history, economic growth, but with its underlying system being the Bank of England, who is the granddaddy of all these systems that we now have. And this has its end game when the United States, after rebelling from Britain and going its own way with its own system and so on, is ultimately recaptured under central banking, which had been formally established in the form of the Bank of England. But in that would have been in the 1690s. By 1913, 1914, you have that central banking element putting America back under a central banking system that has no borders or anything. It is literally a kingdom of merchants worldwide that benefit from this, and they don't do it for the behest of whichever country their central bank is in. It's their own. It's a private system in its origins and so on. But people forget that America broke away as a tax rebellion. Why were they being taxed? Because the King of England was in debt to the central bank over the French, the war with the French, and so on. And he couldn't, because of Magna Carta and because of Cromwell's changes and so on like that. He couldn't overtax his own people, but the people in the colonies were considered to be purely his subjects, and they didn't have parliamentary representation. So I'm going to tax them to pay my debt to the banks, and so these central banks become their own worst enemies in many respects. And America becomes your first example of an attempt, a national attempt to go it without central banking. And it does it very well right up to 1913. It manages to get past that until it gets betrayed and it gets put under this particular system. And now America is the most indebted country on earth.
By miles. Yeah, this is Troy. By the way, I just want to say thank you very much for that sort of historical representation of banking, the usury system, the tricks that come with it. There's very
Mm-hmm.
few people that have that kind of historical knowledge of it all, including myself. That was absolutely brilliant, and that brings us really exceptionally perfectly on to kind of where we are today. I've always looked as America as a country that tried to break through. And of course, in 13, the Federal Reserve Act was
Yep.
officially.
Christmas, December. Mm.
Yeah, it's really interesting because people don't understand the duality with how that took place with the Aldrich Bill. That was the
Mm-hmm.
original bill that tried to get through, and they said, no, we can't put this in the hands of not central bankers, Wall Street. So they put forward the Federal Reserve Act, and they were
Yeah.
both the same people, ran by the same, cartel, if you will. The central banking cartel is what I like to call them.
Mm-hmm.
This brings us beautifully on to where we are today in today's sort of monetary system, because we're at a point now where debt is just growing and growing and growing in the United States. $37 trillion in US
Mm-hmm.
debt. I mean, money itself is being, I think one of the dirty tricks that banks play on us is they inflate our money.
Yeah.
So, and if I asked my grandparents what they bought their house for, it was £4,000 or £5,000. Today, That house is probably worth $750,000. You know, even in recent history, things have been inflated away. And this is all part of impoverishing people and that divide. But you've seen this throughout history. I don't want to be depressing about where we currently are, but it's hard not to, given the state of things and the comparables that we've just identified for what's happened historically and where we currently are today. Where would you say we are today? Astrologically, yeah, by all means.
I'm actually very optimistic in
I'm
terms of
glad to
where
hear
we
that.
are today, simply because we have an opportunity as a species. You know, the way I look at it and so on, because it goes back to essentially what's going to prevail. Is it a society that works on justice, which is the original concept of a creator God? Is it a society, though, that continues to work as on the concept of influence, being able to influence people to your way of thinking or doing things, where that influence is backed up by financial guile and outright violence in many cases? This is a choice that the human species is at, and it is my sense, having done many of these interviews with different people and so on, that people are yearning for the idea of, you know, that it's an age-old idea, but it's not in practice. But it's what people are starting to understand, and that is that everybody should be equal under the law. Highest in the land, lowest in the land. You can have highest, you can have lowest. That's not a problem. Nobody's talking about
That's
in this
life,
kind of
right?
thinking. Yeah, you're not talking about equality of outcome. All right, you're talking about equality of justice and so on. And this is, you see, um, I have a British background. I'm assuming you do as well with your accent and so on. Okay, we're talking here in the UK, and what the British English really established through Magna Carta, but also with the cutting off the head of Charles I, was the first time in history where the top guy didn't get to do what he wanted because he was the top guy. He was held to account according to laws that existed. In case of King Charles, we're not going to let you get away with selling us out back into Roman papal domination again, and so on. That's treason, and so therefore you'll be held to account. That's the first time that has ever happened, and that I know in history and since, where the people who did that didn't establish themselves as the next dynasty. They offered the crown many times to Cromwell and so on, but he became Lord Protector, but he maintained a system that allowed the monarchy to come back, the constitutional monarchy to be established, and so on. So that concept of the rule of law, you know, it's a Chinese writer who said the greatest gift ever given to humankind was the rule of law as personified by the English people, not the British, the English
Wow.
people, for what they did by taking out Charles I. And for that, for his pains, he got put in jail for something like 10 years. He was a Taiwanese Chinese guy who sort of, because he was considered not to be patriotic to the Chinese model of things by claiming that the Anglo-Saxon history had this benefit to it. So this is what most people are actually yearning for. And they have come to understand that one of the key aspects of how people are controlled is obviously through these financial systems that have been established, down through the ages. And it's that knowledge, all right, that they have that makes me optimistic. Now, I'll address what you said about cryptocurrency and so on, but the last time we had an outpouring of knowledge that led to a beneficial, and I'll use the word reformation, gives it away, right, was the Reformation. And it was not caused because everybody decided they wanted to be Protestant or for religious reasons. It was caused because of a technological innovation called the printing press. And what that did was it allowed knowledge to spread in ways that you just couldn't do in the 2,000 years prior to that. It was an absolute revolution. Well, the closest thing that we've got, which may actually supersede Gutenberg printing press, is the internet. And also the idea of blockchain and cryptocurrency operates off the internet. And I know that it's got vulnerabilities and so on. Okay. But for me, the key to it is that as long as blockchain does not become a debt to society, all right, then it's what you would call a legal form of money that goes back to ancient concepts of how you put money in. So most people that I've spoken to and the people they've spoken to, people are getting knowledge. It's crazy stuff out there. The stuff I'm talking about is probably the craziest stuff most people have ever heard, particularly the cosmology and so on like that. But it is nonetheless, this stuff is actually getting out there to give people some form of intellectual choice in what they can go to for understanding how the world works. Podcasts like your own podcast, and the people who I've appeared on their podcasts and that, this kind of stuff 20 years ago, it didn't happen. You would never have heard of me. I would never have, nobody would ever have read my book. It would have been a vanity project that a few family members might have bought out of pity, you know. And you know, but look at where it's gone. I've literally now done hundreds of interviews as a result of that one particular book. And while I'm obviously not correct on everything, and people will find a lot of stuff hard, it makes people think. It gets the brain cells working, and that's all Saturn Death Cult is. It's an introduction to a concept that when you feel manipulated, it's because you are manipulated, and they do it through symbols based on ancient archetypes that can be explained by natural phenomenon that was witnessed by the ancients. And by the way, they're still using it today to manipulate us by putting their little incantations and pictures on dollar notes and coins and things like that, telling us that this guy rules because this guy has authority because he's got this and that thing going for him in terms of symbolism and so on. We're still manipulated. Once that ability to manipulate people fully goes, and that can only happen with knowledge, they no longer have the ability to say to us, hey, we're the central bank, give us the monopoly to issue money to you as a debt and everything's going to be fine. By the way, this is what we're going to issue you. It's called a dollar note. And look at the symbols on it. Look closely and such. Full of Saturn symbols, the eye of God, the pyramids, all that kind of stuff. That will tell you at a deep psychological level where the guy's in charge, because you can't print money and put those symbols on it, because guess what will kill you if you do. And for many of us, this is how we acquiesce our autonomy, particularly in terms of thinking, to these authoritative bodies that have come to be our institutions. That is crumbling even as we sit here. And I look at cryptocurrency, and I look at gold, and I look at people's knowledge of what central banking is, and I think the jig is up for these people.
Troy, I absolutely love that message, because with everything, I mean, it can be very hard, and I always get this. It can be very hard to sort of stand up and to not live on your knees in the face of all of this. But actually, the key is standing up. The key is getting that backbone, understanding that with this knowledge, you can impact people, and together we are simply a unstoppable force that can create a golden age for ourselves, as a collective. And people need to understand.
Define a golden age. Define a golden age as where everybody can rely on an outcome of justice,
Yes.
wherever they are in dispute or have been wronged. They have access to justice. We are then in a golden age, of thought. But that will never happen as long as we issue money as a debt.
Troy, that was an insanely powerful message. It's one that everybody needs to hear, and they need to hear your message. They need to start thinking. That's the key, really. Here is to get people to think about their reality and question it. And you do a sensational job of it. I want to leave links to where people can find you in the description. Really, the last thing for me to do is thank you and see if you've got any kind of closing messages to deliver to people.
Well, my book goes into a bit more detail in terms of the cosmology we discussed. We never got onto McLachlan currents and things like that, the electric universe in full. So, my book is available on Amazon as an ebook, Saturn Death Cult. I run a website, saturndeathcult.com, for people who want to get the bulk of what I say in the book. You'll get the basic message on my website if you can't afford to pay for the book or anything like that. I'm not worried about trying to make as much money out of this. I just want people to be able to read it. So SaturnDeathCult.com is a good place to go. And if we are coming back to this, the only thing I can say as a closing thing that adds to my optimism is that I do believe we're heading into one of the most historic moments of debt jubilee that the world has ever experienced. And for those who don't know what a debt jubilee is, it just simply means a rescinding of all debt, because the central banks have created national debt, but they've done so through a criminal method, interest banking, interest-based currency issuance. And that is going to be addressed, and people are going to wake up and realize that the loan shark who gets done for loan sharking even in our justice system doesn't get to keep living off the debts and collecting the debts of his victims. He doesn't get to keep the money that he's loan sharked of people. And I see exactly the same thing taking place with the central banks. Their debt is onerous, and it's coming to an end. And I'm looking forward to a cross-cultural, cross-religious jubilee taking place in the world over the next 10 years to 20 years. What comes out at the end of that, we can speculate, but that's my closing message of hope for people who see what's going on in the world today financially.
Wow, very powerful. Troy, it's been an absolute pleasure. We're going to leave links to where you can find Troy in the description, his website, where you can get his book. I've bought the book. If you guys are curious, go ahead and do so. That's it from us, Troy.
And the last thing, thank you to you. Thanks to your show for this. I say it without shows like this kind of stuff never gets out anywhere. It's an absolute service that you guys are doing in being able to discuss this. So yeah, thank you very much.
No, I can assure you the pleasure is all mine, Troy. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll see you soon.